The Japanese dragged a Chinese woman out of the crowd. They poured gasoline all over her body. Moments later, a Japanese officer threw a lit match into the gasoline. Flames instantly engulfed the woman's entire body. This act was utterly inhumane. European women were seeing such a scene for the first time. They were so terrified that every joint in their bodies trembled. But the Japanese did not stop. Then they dragged out another European woman. They forced her to kneel on the ground. Sharp bamboo stakes were planted all around her. She could neither move forward nor backward. If she moved, the sharpened bamboo could pierce her flesh at any moment. After being exposed under the sun for a whole day and night, a Japanese officer approached her. He drew his samurai sword and aimed it at her neck. This was one of the most brutal Japanese concentration camps. It held Asians, Europeans, and Australians. This film is adapted from real events. During World War II, Japan suddenly invaded Singapore, catching the British and Dutch garrisons completely off guard. Learning that the city would soon collapse entirely, the British and Australians rushed to send their families onto ships bound for home. However, the ship soon came under attack by Japanese forces at sea. As the ship was about to sink, the women put on life jackets and jumped into the water. Kelly and two companions swam together. The three were fortunate to escape. Judging by the surroundings, they were likely near Sumatra. They comforted each other, believing everything would be fine once they reached shore. But once they finally reached shore, a Japanese motorcycle squad appeared before them. The officer's vehicle stopped in front of them. The one who stepped out was the notoriously cruel Ben Muxalang. He invited the three women onto his vehicle. Inside the vehicle, he boasted shamelessly about their little Japan. Aya reminded him of the conditions of the Geneva Convention. But the Japanese officer shamelessly replied, "Japan never signed the Geneva Convention, so we do not need to take responsibility for prisoners." They took the women to a nearby town. Ben Muxalang said, "Good luck," and then drove away. Seeing the Japanese leave, the three women felt relieved. They felt that this Japanese officer might not be as bad as they expected. But soon after, one woman was struck down with a rifle butt. Another group of Japanese soldiers rushed out. They grabbed the women by their hair and forced them inside. Inside was an open square. All the survivors from the ship were gathered there. The Japanese separated the men from the women. The British were placed at the back of the line. The Australians were placed at the front. They were taken into the concentration camp, one group at a time. From that moment, those noble women who once thought themselves privileged all became slaves under the Japanese iron heel. Prisoners and slaves. On their first day in the camp, all prisoners were gathered on the field. It seemed they were about to hear a speech for the new prisoners, a so-called disciplinary indoctrination. To put it plainly, it was to intimidate the captives. However, from the faces of the new arrivals, it was clear they listened for a long time but didn't understand, unable to grasp what that old Japanese officer was even saying. After he rambled on for a while, the interpreter beside him finally began to speak. At last, the interpreter finally began translating. "I am the highest commander of this prisoner of war camp. Every prisoner must submit to the camp's authority. Colonel Tanaka Kyuichi. Every captive must obey the camp regulations. If they violate the relevant rules of the POW camp, they will be severely punished." The interpreter had not yet finished translating. A woman named Vivian mustered her courage, perhaps because she was the wife of a senior British officer. Forgetting the situation she was in, she directly raised her hand and said, "Sir, I would like to know how much longer we must stay here before we can leave this place." This action directly made the musician, Ed, terrified. He tried to stop her, but it was already too late. "You bastard! Shut up!" The top commander's speech was abruptly interrupted. Such behavior to the Japanese soldiers is a great humiliation. Being beaten is considered mild, and in serious cases, they are shot on the spot. One might think that was all, but unexpectedly, others were dragged into it as well. Such collective punishment mechanisms are also used by the Japanese, one of the coercive methods they favored most. The most vicious and brutal Japanese soldier in the camp, Sergeant Nakamura, gave a single command. At that very moment, the Japanese began to play, their national anthem solemn and mournful, like a funeral dirge. The anthem, it turned out, today was not just a speech for the captives, but also a flag-raising ceremony for the Japanese rising sun. all Japanese soldiers had to salute. Those women who once saw themselves as noble, elegant, and privileged finally experienced what true hell on earth felt like. But they did not expect that those miserable days were only the beginning. Dozens of people had to live together in a thatched hut. Thinking back to their former lives, everything felt like a distant dream. At 6 every morning, the Japanese soldiers would knock on the windows with sticks, as if driving livestock, urging them to get up quickly. The daily meals, besides leftover animal organs and wilted vegetable leaves, they had nothing else to eat. They had to fight each other just to get food. Otherwise, they went hungry. Clearly, the Japanese soldiers' food reserves were running dangerously low as well. Perhaps because they had just arrived at the camp, these noble-born ladies, with their ingrained arrogance and their selfish habits, would fight over even a bar of soap, quarreling and turning against each other, sometimes even coming to blows. The Japanese soldiers treated it as mere entertainment. Because looting from nearby villages yielded less and less food, it could no longer sustain the Japanese army, and those soldiers, of course, would not feed so many free laborers for nothing. Thus, they began enforcing a self-sufficiency policy. Their so-called idea of self-reliance and abundance forced the prisoners to plant crops and till the soil. Meanwhile, the Japanese soldiers sat idly under the shade of trees, supervising the prisoners as they toiled endlessly. Anyone who slowed down or slacked off would be harshly punished. Those punishments were brutally violent and cruel. As time went on, those women who once saw themselves as noble, graceful, and superior had now become obedient and subdued. Moreover, they began to unite and rely on one another, showing care and helping each other. They became close friends. All of them were determined to survive until the very end. But none of them expected that the unsanitary food they ate and the harsh environment caused many of them to fall ill, one after another. The reason was nothing else but that in the tropical jungle, the most common illness was an extremely contagious disease. Within a few days, many more began catching it in succession. If the Japanese soldiers found out that someone was infected, their method of dealing with it was extremely simple and brutal. They would isolate them and execute them collectively. Then, the bodies would be burned. In the camp, there was a German woman. She was a doctor. However, a doctor without medicine was like a cook without rice to cook. She could do nothing. Therefore, she invoked the alliance between Nazi Germany and Japan and requested them to provide medicine. But in the end, she was still flatly rejected by the Japanese. At that critical moment, a local islander named Sura stepped forward. She said, "I can secretly escape and trade with the locals for medicine." Thus, to save the lives of the others, everyone agreed to her extremely risky plan. That night, under the cover of darkness, Sura quietly climbed over the barbed wire fence and successfully obtained medicine from the local villagers, medicine used to treat malaria. No one expected that. The next day, Sura was taken away by Japanese soldiers. It was certain that there was a traitor who betrayed her. The punishment for escape was extremely severe. Sura was forced to kneel before the Japanese commander and his interpreter. Sergeant Nakamura took a bucket of gasoline and poured it directly onto Sura's body. That was the harshest punishment for her attempt to escape. Officer Tanaka lit the fire himself. In front of all the other women, he burned Sura alive. Her heart-wrenching screams echoed through the entire jungle. That inhuman, barbaric act, crueler than any beast, made every woman there seethe in anger, yet unable to speak. Even their sobs they dared not let out. Everyone trembled, their whole bodies shaking uncontrollably with fear. A few days later, those women found an excuse and, with the Japanese soldiers' consent, took Sura's remains and her burned clothing to the forest near the camp and buried them with care. Everyone prayed for her, asking God to protect her soul and lead her to heaven. If there is a next life, may there be no more war. Sura had used her own life in exchange for medicine, finally cured the women who had been infected. After this incident, whether Australian women, British women, or women from other nations, they all united as one. Their aristocratic manners and proud posture, after the inhuman life in the Japanese camp, had completely vanished. They decided to rise and fight back against the Japanese and fight until the end. They could not just die in the camp. They had to survive and return home. From then on, they became warriors and comrades in arms. But what would they use to fight against the Japanese? One day, Sergeant Nakamura came into the dormitory, holding a list in his hand. On that list were the names of many women, all of them young. Anyone whose name appeared on it was forced onto a military truck and taken to a luxurious mansion. No one knew what they were being taken for. As soon as they entered the mansion, on the large table before them were all kinds of fresh fruits and delicious food. Every woman's stomach began to rumble with hunger, because for more than a year, they had not tasted such fresh fruit and such delicious food again. The Japanese interpreter began translating the order from the camp's supreme commander, Tanaka Juichi, to the women who had been chosen. As long as they agreed to provide comfort services for the Japanese soldiers and become comfort women, they could stay in this villa and enjoy a luxurious life. Upon hearing this, the women began murmuring among themselves. They discussed and finally realized the Japanese wanted them to serve as sexual slaves and at the same time argued whether they should accept it or not, because the temptation before them was too difficult to resist. In truth, this was merely a trap set by the Japanese to turn them into comfort women for their troops. Compared to Asians, the Japanese treated Western women somewhat less harshly, because deep down, they still feared that after the war, the West would seek revenge. Therefore, toward these Western women, joining the Comfort Corps was not forced upon them, but presented as voluntary. Under such temptation, some women could not resist. Many women gave in because they did not want to return to the camp where they could be slaughtered at any moment. Living like pigs and dogs, they willingly joined the ranks of the comfort women. Some women just wanted to take one hot bath and wear clean, pretty clothes, and were willing to give up their dignity, since it was a personal choice. So, no matter how others tried to dissuade them, it was in vain. At the time of parting, they could only wish one another well, hoping the coming days would bring peace. Each wished for the other's safety. However, this was a Japanese prison camp, a true living hell. There was no such thing as peace or safety. Perhaps in the very next moment, they could be killed by the Japanese. Those women who joined the ranks of the comfort women, did they really get to live in luxury villas and enjoy fresh, delicious food? The answer, of course, was no. They were painfully naive. Those comfort women, soon after, were sent to the battlefronts, where the real hell awaited them. That path was a path with no return. Compared to the concentration camp, that camp was almost merciful. So then, what fate awaited those women in the end? Time quickly moved into the year 1944. In the Pacific War, the Japanese forces had already begun to fall back on every front. In the Japanese-occupied Western Indonesia, inside the concentration camp on Sumatra Island, the women who had been forced into the comfort women units only, a few of them were still alive. As for the prisoners still in the camp, they continued to endure imprisonment and abuse. But at least they were alive. As long as they lived, there was still hope. One night, the musician, Eddie, was quietly humming a tune. A Christian matron nearby overheard it. She overheard the melody clearly, and she was even able to name the song. Eddie was stunned by this moment. He never expected that, among the women he'd lived with for 2 years, there was someone who truly understood and loved music. The two instantly felt an unspoken connection, as if they had finally found a soulmate in this harsh place. Whenever they had time, the two would sit together and talk endlessly. And of course, they talked about music. Slowly, the same idea arose in both their minds. They wanted to start a choir that would help these suffering women regain their confidence and the courage to keep living, a way for them to find hope again and to resist the cruelty of the Japanese soldiers through the power of music. Unexpectedly, when Eddie sang the choir's first song, All the Women, it felt as if they had returned to who they once were. Their spirits ignited with passion once more. When it came to joining the choir, they agreed wholeheartedly without a moment's hesitation. 1 call, and 100 answered. More and more women volunteered to join on their own accord. Only the German doctor seemed hesitant and unconvinced. Even though she too understood music, she believed that in a concentration camp, forming such a group might provoke the Japanese guards. And in their anger, They might just kill everyone on the spot. Her concerns were not without reason. But who would listen to just one voice? They had already made up their minds. So they acted without delay. After several days of practice, one night, Eddie and the Christian matron led the women of the choir to gather on the open field. There, they began their performance. Such a commotion did not escape the Japanese sentries. They immediately reported it to Sergeant Nakamura. He rushed over at once, watching from a distance. He wanted to see what these women were up to. And as more and more women gathered, the group kept growing. Sergeant Nakamura watched in alarm. This was unacceptable. Were these women planning to rebel? So, he ordered the gates to be opened. He led several Japanese soldiers and slowly marched toward them. On the women's side, everyone was already in position. The Christian matron saw the soldiers approaching and signaled Eddie to begin immediately. Eddie glanced sideways, then started without hesitation. To everyone's astonishment, this choir formed inside a concentration camp, sang with voices like those of angels. For a moment, everyone forgot that this was still wartime, forgot the war, even for just a breath. It was clear from the soldiers' reactions, they weren't stopping the performance. Not only did they not interfere, they stood, listening, deeply captivated. Such is the power of music, the true power of music. It knows no borders. Soon after, time swept forward into the year 1945. Japan's defeat was drawing near. Perhaps because of the choir, the Japanese guards and the women in the camp managed to coexist in fragile peace. But no one expected that one night, that very night, musician Eddie got up to use the restroom. But unexpectedly, Sergeant Nakamura grabbed her from behind and covered her mouth and nose. Eddie broke free and landed a fierce slap that knocked Nakamura to the ground. He fell face first, stunned and humiliated. The sight terrified Eddie. Striking a Japanese soldier was unthinkable. How could she possibly get away with this? As expected, the soldiers rushed in and beat Eddie mercilessly. 2 of her ribs were broken on the spot, broken instantly under their blows. Then Eddie was thrown into a bamboo cage. At daybreak, Nakamura's superior, Captain Tanaka of the military police, came personally to interrogate Eddie. The moment she was released from the cage, she was beaten again by Captain Tanaka himself. In the end, Captain Tanaka ordered that Eddie be publicly executed in 3 days. This news left all the women shaken and distressed. They couldn't just stand by and do nothing. So, the Christian matron and Susan, along with a nun, personally went to plead an audience with the highest-ranking Japanese commander, Colonel Tanaka Kyuichi. They begged him to spare musician Eddie, recounting in full what had happened that night. But Colonel Tanaka rejected their plea immediately. Eddie failed to salute a Japanese soldier. Such disrespect is absolutely forbidden. Striking a soldier is punishable by death. There is no room for negotiation. At that time, Japan prided itself on strict military etiquette. This hypocritical reasoning pushed Susan beyond her limit. She retorted sharply, "Japanese soldiers have no right to speak of etiquette. You invade other nations, burn, kill, and loot, committing every imaginable evil. You harm women and children. Such crimes alone prove Japanese soldiers are unworthy of being called human." Fortunately, Colonel Tanaka didn't understand what Susan was actually saying, and the interpreter, fearing punishment, didn't dare translate the truth. He only gave a vague, harmless version. By then, Japan's defeat was nearing, and the commander feared future consequences. After much deliberation, Colonel Tanaka decided to release Eddie after all. Eddie's willpower was unbelievably strong. Despite the inhuman torture inflicted by the soldiers, and even with 2 ribs broken, she managed to survive. A small mercy in a world filled with cruelty. After yet another routine Japanese flag-raising ceremony, the camp's highest commander was delivering a speech. Winnie, wearing a straw hat, bent forward slightly and suddenly shouted out a curse. "Eat dirt, you Japanese locusts!" At that moment, Eddie and Susan beside her also began shouting insults. Susan added, "Your flag looks like a stained napkin, like a fried egg in the middle." Unexpectedly, just a few meters away, Captain Tanaka of the military police heard everything. After the moment of silence ended, the interpreter then translated the announcement of Japan's victories. End quote. He translated it again clearly. When he mentioned that Australia had already sought peace with Japan, the Australian woman Susan shouted again, "Nonsense!" That single word was once again overheard by Captain Tanaka. After the interpreter finished, he and the camp commander turned to leave immediately. Just as Nakamura was about to dismiss the formation, was stopped abruptly by Captain Tanaka. It was clear something serious was about to happen. Nakamura, if you step out of the line, now, it was over. Captain Tanaka of the military police questioned her sternly. "What were you saying just now?" Susan replied calmly. "I said, this month is the hottest time of the entire year." And with that, the Australian woman Susan was taken by Captain Tanaka and sentenced to a brutal punishment, a torture inflicted without mercy. This torture forced the prisoner to kneel on the ground, surrounded front and back by rows of sharp bamboo stakes. Each stake angled into the soil at 45 degrees, and on her shins was placed a bamboo tube wrapped in barbed wire. Her hands were tied behind her back. If she leaned forward or backward or even tried to sit, the sharp bamboo stakes and the barbed wire would pierce her flesh. So she was forced to stand upright under the scorching sun. One must admit the cruelty of the Japanese soldiers was beyond imagination. The other women could only stand there helplessly, watching Susan being tortured by the soldiers. There was nothing they could do. Time passed, second by second. But for Susan, every second was a deadly torment. Hours slipped by just like that. The Christian matron could no longer bear to watch, so she carried a bucket of water and walked toward Susan, hoping to give her a drink. But she was stopped by the nearby guards. The Christian matron had no choice but to return to the dormitory. Night finally fell, making the heat slightly more bearable. However, after kneeling this long, Susan's knees and legs were completely numb. She could no longer feel anything. One wrong move forward or backward, and the sharp bamboo stakes would kill her instantly. So if she wanted to survive, she had to endure, no matter what. The German woman could no longer look on either. If they didn't find a way to save Susan, she would surely die. So she secretly met with the Japanese interpreter and told him, "Nazi Germany will soon be defeated. Japan will follow the same fate. So you must warn your highest commanding officer at this point, you absolutely cannot kill any more Western prisoners. Once the war is lost, the West will demand full accountability." The interpreter replied, "Colonel Tanaka never accepts threats." The German woman answered, "Then at least remind him gently. Let him sense the danger." The interpreter fell silent, unsure if he should take the risk. The next day at noon, Captain Tanaka of the military police arrived with Sergeant Nakamura and another Japanese soldier, heading towards Susan, who was barely conscious, ready to collapse at any moment. What were they planning? Were they here to finish her off? Everything suggested Susan's fate was sealed. It looked as if the Japanese were truly preparing to execute her. At that moment, all the women could no longer bear to watch. Was Captain Tanaka truly going to kill Susan? But unexpectedly, a small lock of Susan's hair fell to the ground. It seemed the German woman's request to the interpreter had finally worked. The intervention had succeeded. Everyone realized it had all been a false alarm. Captain Tanaka of the military police took one last look at Susan, then turned and walked away. It was clear now, as long as they could hold on, the day they left this camp would eventually come. Freedom no longer felt like an illusion. It seemed the German woman had been right all along. Once the big brother of the fascist Axis, Nazi Germany, surrendered, Japan's capitulation would not be far behind. The women rushed forward, lifting Susan, who was barely breathing, and brought her down from the torture stand. Soon after, time moved into February 1945. In the days that followed, the Japanese and the prisoners in the camp maintained a tense but fragile peace. By then, both the Japanese soldiers and the women in the camp understood very well Japan's defeat was only a matter of time. Everyone was waiting for the day Japan surrendered. Then, one day, the Japanese suddenly gave the order to evacuate the camp immediately. This abrupt and hasty move threw the women into a state of panic and fear. They all worried that the Japanese would execute them all. Eddie immediately asked. She asked the Japanese interpreter, and finally learned. Japan had been completely defeated by the Allied forces. Therefore, the camp had no choice but to be evacuated. Dozens of military trucks loaded with all the women and children finally drove away the camp that had imprisoned them for more than 3 years. But now, where would they be taken next? The women still carried deep worry in their hearts. Panic and fear clung to them. What exactly would the Japanese do to them? Given Japan's brutal history, the possibility of mass execution was frighteningly high. In the end, everything depended on the decision of Japan's highest commander. During the evacuation, Winnie suddenly spotted her husband, a British Army officer. He had been captured by the Japanese, escaped once, but was later captured again. His fate, as she feared, was tragically predictable. Overwhelmed by grief, Winnie fell into despair. The Japanese transported them to a railway station, suggesting they would be moved by train. No one knew whether that journey would lead them to salvation or damnation. Every woman could only accept their fate in silence. After getting off the train, the Japanese took them to yet another place, a deserted village, emptier and harsher than the camp before. Conditions here were far worse than anything they had endured. Although the Japanese barely managed them now, they had stopped giving out food entirely. As a result, the women were starving, stomachs clinging to their backs. With no choice left, they had to find food on their own, whatever they could. Crawling snails, frogs leaping in the mud, all became precious meals for survival. For them, this was the only way to stay alive. Because of this desperate foraging, combined with the brutal environment, many fell gravely ill. Before the Japanese even had a chance to execute them, malaria had already taken more than half of them. The village became a field of graves, filled with the resting places of the dead. Soon, the entire place turned into a terrifying cemetery. And in the end, Winnie could no longer hold on. She died from grief and depression. At this moment, the survivors were drowning in despair. Hope was slipping from their hands. Just when they felt they had no strength left to live on, suddenly the camp's highest Japanese commander appeared. Colonel Tanaka Kyuichi gathered every surviving woman. He announced to them, "The Empire of Japan has surrendered. We have lost the war. It is over. From now on, you are all free. You may return home." This day was the 15th of August, 1945. When the women heard the news, they could hardly believe it. 3 years of hell felt like a fading nightmare. Their tears burst forth uncontrollably. Tears of joy, disbelief, and relief. They embraced each other tightly. For the first time in years, they could breathe again. During 3 cruel years, British musician Ed formed a makeshift choir. With their voices, they pulled countless women back from the brink of death. They lived by one belief: if life wounds me with pain, I shall answer it with song. Through music, they resisted the darkness of war. They stood against the cruelty of fascism. They testified to the world the crimes committed would never be forgotten. And they held on to one final hope: a world of lasting peace. A world with no more war. A world where no one suffers as they did. That is their wish for all humanity.